In this lecture, we're going to address divine command morality. So divine command morality is not secular ethics per se, but it is given rise to, interestingly, in Socrates, not in some organized religion. As always, we're focused on trying to hit the goal, hit the mark, the target of good, right, and ought, and thinking in those categories. And so when it comes to divine command moral theory, we're not using what's written in Wolff because, although Wolff is quite good, this isn't his area of expertise, and so I don't think he covers it sufficiently. Divine command morality is the idea that good is what God or the gods say that it is. That is its formal definition. Divine command morality is that good equals what God or the gods say good is. That's what good is. So one-to-one correspondence. If God says it's good, that's what makes it good. So the place that we encounter this is in the writings of Plato and in the Euthyphro dialogue. Now Socrates is on his way to the trial that is going to take place, that's described in Plato's Apology, where he's having to defend himself and on trial for his very life and all that he's taught. And as he's making his way there, he encounters this young man named Euthyphro, who's also going to a trial, but it's a trial where he's going to take his father to court. And as Socrates listens to him and questions him, he realizes this young man has some odd ideas. What has happened is Euthyphro had a servant. Let me hit the pause button here for a second and just say that servants or slaves in that day and in that place are not like when we think in terms of slavery as it existed in the United States and in Great Britain. Rather, people who are slaves in the ancient world get to be slaves by one of two primary routes, as far as ancient Athens. Either you defaulted on your debts, you could not pay, and so you became the equivalent of an indentured servant, and you had to work off your debt, and that's what made you a servant or a slave. Or you were a POW, you were somebody who was taken captive in a battle, in a war. And the term redemption comes from the idea of buying back these POWs. Either countries or families would pay the price to get their loved one back. That's the idea. So here's a servant of Euthyphro who rises up. He gets drunk one night. He rises up and he kills a servant of Euthyphro's father by slitting his throat. Euthyphro's father takes this man, has him bound, and they throw him into an irrigation ditch so that he can't escape. He can't get up and run away without the usage of his hands. He has him bound and thrown in there, and they send for a magistrate to come and to judge and decide what's going to be done with this man. They need an interpreter also to understand what the man is saying. And so what happens is the man dies of exposure before the magistrate gets there. So Euthyphro is now taking his father to court for having murdered the murderer, so to speak. And Socrates is kind of surprised by this. He says this is rather strange. And, well, what Euthyphro says is, I'm doing this because it is the pious thing to do. It's the religious thing to do. If somebody is pious, they're devout, they're respectful of religious belief. So Socrates asks him, what is piety? Now, what are you doing here? And what Euthyphro says is, piety is prosecuting my father. And the explanation that he gives as to why that's pious to do that is because there's one of the gods, one of the Greek gods that the Athenians supposedly worship, who he prosecutes his father for what the father does wrong. And so Socrates says, so because the god has done it, that's why you're doing it? What does it mean to be pious? And he says to be pious is to please the gods, to do what the gods say we should do. Well, Socrates points out to him that the Greek gods have contradicted one another and they don't act consistently. So how would you know which god to follow as far as the example of their life? And so Euthyphro has to regroup and stop and think, and then he comes back and he says, okay, I've got it. What all the gods love is pious, and what they all hate is impious. In other words, goodness is what all the gods love, badness, moral badness, is what they hate. And then it is Socrates' response to this that creates the category of divine command morality. Socrates asks him, is something pious or good because the gods will it, or do they will it because it's good? See this question, what it's doing? The question is saying, what makes good good? Your initial discussions in this class and some of your initial readings were addressing this very thing. What makes good good? Is something pious or good, in this case, because the gods will it, or do they will it because it's good? Now, the first part, if it's pious or good because the gods will it, then good is just this arbitrary thing. Whatever the gods say is good is good. If the gods say that cannibalism is good, it's good. Or do they will it because it's good? If they will it because it's good, then it means that there's something outside the category of deity that is the definition of good. It's either co-eternal with the gods, or it might be even a category above them to which they must submit. And so the question becomes, where did that come from? So the point in critiquing this idea is its arbitrariness. What if the god or the gods said that theft was good? Or that, genocide was good? Would that therefore make it good? So the problem is it seems like this sets us up for blind following without thinking or using our minds and engaging the issue of what's good and bad. That's the worry. It needs to be said that in Judaism, in Christianity, and in Islam, this is a minority position. However, it does need to also be said that in Christianity there are three big names, even though there's not many people who hold to this. There's three big names who did hold to this. One of them was Martin Luther, for whom Martin Luther King Sr. and Martin Luther King Jr. are named. He's the 16th century reformer. Martin Luther, a Protestant. He was a Catholic and became what we call a Protestant. And then there's John Calvin, one of the other magisterial reformers. John Calvin the Swiss. So Luther was German. Calvin is Swiss. He's actually French, but in Switzerland. And those two men held to this position. And then one of our most brilliant philosophers of all time, the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, held to this position. So although it's a minority position, some people find it very persuasive, the idea that good is just based on what God says good is. So the typical comeback to this is, you're going to see here. How can anybody hold this position? Well, oddly enough, their motivation, if you think of a Luther, a Calvin, a Kierkegaard, their motivation for doing so is philosophical. They fear that if they don't say this, then there is some entity, this entity, the good in the universe, that is co-eternal with God and to which God may in fact have to submit. And that seems to be a problem for the logic and the intellectual credibility of their faith. To them it seems to be anyway. Religious opponents of divine command morality, there's way more of those than there are supporters of it, say that the question is being framed wrongly. In Christianity, where you have those other two, the two most famous individuals who've engaged this are Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century, 12th and 13th century philosopher and theologian, and then also Leibniz, Gottfried Leibniz. And so these two men have given a good rebuttal of this, as have others. But religious opponents of divine command morality say that the question is being framed wrongly. So that is an act morally right because God wills it to be so, or does God will it to be so because it's morally right, is essentially what's being asked by Socrates and then being asked in the world of religion. And in reality, what they say is it ought to be framed like this. Why does God declare murder? Or why does God declare incest? Or why does God declare adultery to be bad? Or why does God declare compassion or mercy or justice to be good? And the religious opponents of divine command theory say that God created human beings in our world, and that what makes for human thriving or well-being is essentially what God calls good. The idea that goodness is godness. You're setting up a false dichotomy between good and God. In reality, God is in his basic character good, and so God's always going to do and prescribe that which is good for his creatures. For Jews, Christians, and Muslims, Abraham is considered to be the father of their faiths. All of the religions of the book, the primary monotheistic religions, look back in time to Abraham as the beginning of their differing faiths. Christianity is the largest faith in the world, and Islam is the second largest faith in the world. All of these people look to Abraham. That's important. There's a reason I'm mentioning this. For ethnic Jews, he and his wife Sarah are believed to be their biological ancestors. They're the beginning of the Jewish race. For Christians, he's the ancient ancestor of Jesus, who was a Jew. For Muslims, he's the father of Ishmael, who is the ancestor of the Arab peoples. So we would look to Abraham and see, did Abraham hold this idea? If divine command morality is in accordance with the teaching of those religions, you'd expect to see evidence of that in their holy writings, in their scriptures. So in the Torah, or the Tanakh of the Jews, in the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, which includes the Tanakh for Christians, and especially in the Quran, and there's other writings as well, for Arabs. However, we don't see that divine command morality is taught or given an example of. Rather, we see that Abraham, the father of these faiths, who's referred to in the Bible as the friend of God, he dared to question God. In Genesis 18, God talks about judgment he's going to bring, and Abraham grills God and asks him, puts a lot of questions before him, and when he gets done, he says, "Will not the judge of all the earth do right?" And there's a question, aren't you going to do things that are appropriate and moral? So it'd be a mistake to think that Abraham was passive and submissive and docile before God. Not only Abraham, but also Moses. In the book of Exodus, Moses questions God. And Moses does something very similar, so in a different situation. For most Jews, Christians, and Muslims, the assumption is that God gave us brains for a reason. Put yourself, if God could be compared to a parent, put yourself in God's shoes. Parents want their children to be able to think and reason for themselves. That's an important part of growing up. They reason, the Jews, Christians, and Muslims, based on their scriptures, that if there truly is a deity, then that deity must want his people to use their minds and not just obey blindly. So Socrates' question, which frames the issue of divine command morality, is this: is something pious or good because the gods will it, or do they will it because it is good? Thus we can affirm here, and this will be our definition, you'll have it in the midterm, that divine command morality is that belief that maintains that good is what God or the gods say that it is. And the primary objection to that is how arbitrary it is. We're going to see that there's some parallels between this and cultural relativism as time goes on.